On June 22, 1941, when Nazi Germany launched its invasion of the Soviet Union, an unprecedented chapter of destruction and resistance began. The so-called Operation Barbarossa sent millions of Axis soldiers deep into Soviet territory. In their wake, they razed villages, set farms ablaze, and sowed terror. Faced with such an onslaught, Moscow mobilized every available resource. Factories were converted to war production, youths were sent to the front, and, for the first time on such a scale, women left their homes and offices to put on uniforms. In the industrial cities of Leningrad and on the steppes of Kazakhstan, speeches rang out appealing to socialist equality and the survival of the motherland. For decades, the Soviet regime had formally proclaimed gender equality, but the reality of the barracks remained profoundly male. The German invasion upset that balance. Aware that survival depended on everyone's participation, the state opened the way for women to take on combat roles. Propaganda showed women with rifles and airplanes in an effort to normalize their presence at the front, though in practice they still faced the skepticism of superiors and comrades. A rallying cry echoed across the nation. Nothing must be left outside the defense of the motherland. And soon, more than 800,000 women answered the call. This narrative not only recounts the entry of those combatants into the trenches, it also delves into the horrors they suffered when they were captured, tortured, or executed by the enemy. What led Nazi soldiers to despise these women so much? Why have their stories been silenced and their sacrifices forgotten? Welcome to Wartime Archive. Women's mobilization in the Red Army. To grasp the magnitude of the call-up, one must remember that Operation Barbarossa was not an isolated attack, but a gigantic campaign that involved 3 million German soldiers and hundreds of thousands of auxiliary units. In the first weeks, cities like Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev fell one after another. The Soviet state, distrustful of its Western neighbors, but not expecting such speed, faced a tide of refugees and crumbling defensive lines. The initial terror turned into determination. The radio broadcast speeches by Stalin appealing to the defense of the motherland. Patriotic songs such as Katyusha became hymns of hope. Komsomol pioneers, previously engaged in youth activities, began training on firing ranges. Civil defense measures were instituted in every town: trench digging, nighttime blackouts, and neighborhood watch. This atmosphere of urgency was felt in university classrooms, on assembly lines, and on collective farms, where the absence of men forced women to drive tractors and harvesters, while factories produced tanks and airplanes. Social context also influenced women's incorporation. The accelerated industrialization of the 1930s had brought many women into arms and construction factories. Their experience with heavy labor provided a foundation for military tasks. Draft notices reached remote villages, summoning peasant women who had scarcely left their hamlets. Upon arriving at training centers, they confronted military discipline and grueling physical instruction. They learned to strip and clean rifles, to march through snow, and to navigate at night. Instructors subjected them to trials as demanding as those for men, since it had to be proven that their admission would not reduce unit efficiency. Motivations were varied. Some enlisted out of the need to protect their families. Others wanted to avenge the death of loved ones. Still others were drawn by the idea of adventure or by the honors that, at least in theory, would come with service. Propaganda promised equality and recognition, though reality was more complex. Many women obtained command positions in theory, only to encounter a glass ceiling. The language of manuals remained masculine. Orders spoke to soldiers without considering gender differences. Even so, women's presence in the ranks grew to the point that, in some units, they made up nearly half the personnel. The national emergency represented by the Nazi invasion forced the Soviet state to rethink its military structures. Despite decades of egalitarian rhetoric, women's presence in the Red Army before 1941 was marginal. The first months of the war showed that the available men would not be enough to halt the Wehrmacht's advance. Officially, the door to female mobilization was opened. The number of enrollees rose rapidly. By mid-1943, about 348,000 women were already serving in the armed forces. A year later, in 1944, the number reached 473,000. In total, more than 800,000 women would serve throughout the conflict. The road to the uniform was not easy. Many young Soviet women came from factories, farms, or universities. Recruiters visited schools and workplaces to persuade them to enlist. The Army opened accelerated training centers where they received instruction in infantry, artillery, communications, medical services, and aviation. In parallel, all-female air regiments were created thanks to aviator Marina Raskova, who persuaded Stalin of the need to have women in the skies. Thus were born 3 units formed and led by them: a fighter regiment, a bomber regiment, and a night bombing regiment. At first, many were assigned to traditional tasks such as nursing or logistics. However, desperation at the front compelled their integration into combat units. They soon proved their worth in anti-aircraft artillery, in engineer corps, and as scouts. Their incorporation posed a cultural challenge for officers accustomed to commanding exclusively male units. There was resistance and mockery, but the performance of these women, along with propaganda presenting them as heroic daughters of the motherland, began to change perceptions. Statistics show that military health care depended almost entirely on them. By 1944, women made up around 40% of medics, 43% of surgeons, and 57% of medical orderlies. In improvised academies, future combatants learned to fire Mosin-Nagant rifles, to throw grenades, to dig trenches, and to read maps. Training had to be swift to fill vacancies at the front. Every recruit was required to show discipline and endurance. Instructors repeated that there would be no distinctions. A woman commanding a gun had to handle it, just like a man. Over time, the first graduates became instructors for later cohorts. This accelerated cycle kept a steady stream of personnel to replace the enormous losses suffered in battles such as Smolensk, Kiev, and Kharkiv. Despite the haste, many reached levels of professionalism comparable to soldiers with years of experience. There were also women who entered the war through the partisan divisions, the resistance groups operating behind enemy lines. They worked as couriers, nurses, and fighters, sabotaging routes and relaying crucial information. Meanwhile, in besieged cities, volunteers sewed uniforms, gathered provisions, and organized civil defense. Women's mobilization was a social phenomenon of vast scope. Women of all ages and regions became directly or indirectly involved in the defense of the Soviet Union. The massive entry of women into the Red Army was not only a response to the need to fill ranks, but also an ideological attempt to demonstrate socialist equality. Propaganda exalted female soldiers as examples of sacrifice and courage. Yet rhetoric did not always translate into effective equality within units. In many cases, women had to fight for the respect of their comrades and overcome deeply entrenched stereotypes. Their presence on the battlefields and in field hospitals not only saved lives, it set a unique precedent in military history, redefining the role of women in war. Snipers and aviators wore through the scope and the sky. Sniper schools emerged in response to the need to neutralize enemy leadership. These academies selected women with keen eyesight and nerves of steel. Training included exercises in patience. They had to remain motionless for hours, awaiting a target. They were taught to calculate ballistics and to anticipate the enemy's movement. Camouflage clothing was mandatory, as was mastery of the terrain. Many learned to move without leaving tracks and to hunt enemy snipers. The success of the women snipers was measured not only by the number of kills, but by the fear they instilled. German soldiers began to fear every bush or window. Although their achievements were reported in the press, they did not receive the same recognition as their male counterparts until decades later. Forming the so-called night witches required adapting to rudimentary aircraft. The crews, pilot and navigator, both women, flew without radios or parachutes. On night missions, they navigated by simple maps and stars. They could complete as many as 8 sorties in a single night. The wheels of the Po-2 biplanes were vulnerable, and if they blew out on landing, the aviators had to repair them in the dark. To increase precision, they sometimes flew so low they could hear enemy conversations. Reports by German commanders show that these constant raids sapped troop morale, depriving them of rest at night. Years later, veterans like Polina Gelman proudly recalled the camaraderie born of those exhausting missions. The women who served in the Red Army quickly showed they could occupy elite roles. The snipers became one of the enemy's most feared weapons. Trained at shooting schools outside Moscow and Voronezh, they learned to fire accurately from concealed positions. They used Mosin Nagant rifles equipped with telescopic sights and blended into their surroundings. Their targets were officers, artillery observers, and enemy shooters. A single well-placed bullet could halt the advance of an entire unit. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, a young history student who enlisted as a sniper, became a symbol of women's effectiveness on the battlefield. She fought in the defenses of Odessa and Sevastopol and amassed more than 300 confirmed kills. Her fame crossed borders when she was sent to the United States in 1942 to rally support for the Soviet war effort. Nicknamed Lady Death by the Western press, Pavlichenko explained in interviews that she took no pleasure in killing, but understood that each shot saved her compatriots. Her testimony dismantled the notion that women were incapable of the lethal effectiveness required in combat. Another prominent figure was Nina Lubkovskaya, who led a platoon of women snipers during the final assault on Berlin. She and her subordinates infiltrated the ruins of the burning city, scaling shattered buildings to shoot at German positions. Lubkovskaya's letters reveal the mix of responsibility and horror she felt. "I look through the scope, and I know I must pull the trigger. I think of my fallen sisters, of the villages burned to the ground, and I fire," she wrote. While the snipers stalked on the ground, other women took the war to the sky. The 46th Guards Night Bomber Regiment, known to the Germans as the Night Witches, was composed entirely of women. They flew Po-2 biplanes of wood and canvas, obsolete in principle but perfect for night missions. They cut their engines when nearing the target and glided in silence before dropping fragmentation bombs. The whisper of their wings caused panic among Nazi troops, who heard them only when it was too late. Nadezhda Popova was among the most notable aviators. She flew more than 850 combat missions during the war, sometimes up to 18 in a single night. Alongside her comrades, she endured sub-zero temperatures, anti-aircraft fire, and the constant threat of enemy fighters. During the Battle of Kursk and the Crimean Offensive, the Night Witches' raids destroyed ammunition depots, trains, and troop concentrations. The regiment carried out more than 23,000 sorties and dropped over 3,000 tons of bombs. It lost 32 pilots, but 23 of its members were recognized as heroes of the Soviet Union, the highest military honor. The witches proved that courage and skill could turn a slow plane into a lethal weapon. Beyond snipers and aviators, other women stood out in artillery, armor, and communications. Some served as radio operators on the battlefield, transmitting coordinates under bombardment. Others repaired telephone cables severed by shells, crawling among corpses to keep units connected. There were even women who became fighter and reconnaissance pilots, like Lilia Litviak and Katya Budanova, who shot down enemy aircraft and paid with their lives. In every role, Soviet women showed that discipline, intelligence, and stamina mattered more than gender. Their valor buoyed the morale of their comrades and altered the enemy's perception, which began to fear the sniper's precision and the night aviator's persistence. The stories of these women inspired thousands of new recruits streaming to the front. Their examples shattered prejudices and showed that talent does not depend on sex. Although their names were celebrated in Soviet newspapers and radio broadcasts, many returned to anonymity after the war. Their legacy was filed away in military archives, while post-war propaganda again exalted the male soldier. Yet on the battlefields of Stalingrad, Kursk, and Berlin, Soviet women snipers and aviators proved to the world that women could shape the outcome of a war. Surviving the horror, hunger, cold, and trauma. The wear of war was evident in small details. Many fighters improvised insoles with newspapers to insulate their feet from the cold. When provisions ran short, they boiled leather belts or ate stray cats. Letters sent home were full of euphemisms about hunger and cold, so as not to worry their families. In some regiments, women cut their hair to avoid lice, or to go unnoticed if captured. The lack of clean water forced them to bathe in icy rivers or to forego hygiene for weeks. Psychological trauma manifested in recurring nightmares, bouts of anxiety, and long silences. The women recalled that, after the war, it was impossible to get used to city noise, because every loud sound reminded them of explosions. Many suffered from what was then called war hysteria, a term we would now identify as post-traumatic stress disorder. Without a psychological support system, they took refuge in writing or in late-night conversations with comrades. These accounts, compiled in diaries such as those of Yevfrosinia Kirsnovskaya, reveal the inner life of those who survived the front. As women proved their capacity to fight, they also faced extreme living conditions. The Eastern Front was a land of mud, snow, and blood. In winter, temperatures dropped to 30 degrees below zero. The women soldiers, like their male counterparts, often lacked adequate clothing. Their boots froze solid, their uniforms were soaked, and frost gathered on their eyelashes. The cold became an enemy as deadly as bullets. It is estimated that at least 1 in 5 Soviet troops suffered serious frostbite in the early years of the war. Many lost fingers or limbs and were rendered unfit for combat. Hunger was another constant adversary. Official rations varied according to the situation at the front, but in battles such as Stalingrad and Leningrad, they could be reduced to a piece of dark bread, barely 250 grams, and a watery soup per day. To maintain strength, many gathered herbs, hunted small animals, or dug up roots in the forests. Malnutrition caused weakness, dizziness, and fainting. Even so, the women had to march for miles with ammunition on their backs, dig trenches in frozen ground, and carry the wounded. The will to live and to save their comrades became the fuel that kept them moving forward. Sanitary conditions in the trenches and field hospitals were precarious. Epidemics of dysentery, typhus, and pneumonia spread rapidly among soldiers sharing barracks. The fighters lacked basic hygiene products. Menstruation, a topic not even mentioned in military manuals, became a daily obstacle. Many used improvised rags that had to be washed in contaminated water, risking infections. Access to doctors was limited, and the few available treated dozens of wounded at a time. When a woman was injured, she discovered that hospitals were not prepared for her. There was no underwear in her size, nor specific gynecological care. Even so, thousands of doctors and nurses worked themselves to the bone to improve conditions and provide dignity amid the chaos. Beyond physical suffering, psychological trauma left a permanent mark. Battles were a succession of scenes of horror, mutilated corpses, cries of pain, fires, and destruction. Many women developed what we now know as PTSD. In her memoirs, Nurse Zoya Kroll wrote that she stopped sleeping so as not to hear the laments of the wounded who died unattended. Doctors did not understand these symptoms, and the women soldiers were encouraged to stay strong and hide their feelings. Tears were seen as weakness. The consequences soon appeared: anxiety, depression, and panic attacks. Even so, friendship among comrades became a crucial support. They cared for one another, shared bites of bread, lent clothing, and encouraged each other to endure. The bonds of trust forged in the trenches, born of solidarity in extreme circumstances, were one of the few sources of comfort. Doctors and nurses played a vital role in this devastated environment. Armed with stretchers and medical kits, they entered combat zones to rescue the wounded. Many accounts speak of women who carried unconscious soldiers on their backs, while bullets whistled around them. Maria Petrovna Smirnova, a medic who served on the Kalinin front, carried out more than 480 evacuations under fire. The courage of these women was indispensable to saving lives and maintaining morale. To confront trauma and fear, some kept diaries. They wrote about anguish, losses, and the small joys they shared. A cup of hot tea, a song in chorus, a letter from home. These writings are today testimonies to the war's psychological toll. Many survivors said the memory of those years accompanied them for the rest of their lives. The horrors of the front, combined with the lack of recognition upon returning, left a generation of women with invisible scars. Even so, their resilience was evident in their ability to carry out orders and assume tasks their superiors had never imagined for them. They marched with the same determination as men. They fired weapons, drove trucks, and operated heavy machinery. Each day was a test of human endurance. Surviving extreme cold, hunger, and psychological trauma became a trial that only solidarity, discipline, and the desire to defend the motherland allowed them to pass. Clandestine struggle, partisans, and guerrilla war. The courage of the partisans was measured not only by successful missions, but by their to sustain hope among civilians. In occupied villages, women infiltrators organized networks to hide wounded Soviet soldiers and Jews persecuted by the Nazis. They built hiding places in barns and caves, transported food clandestinely, and shared information about searches and raids. Such actions required a mix of audacity and empathy. Those who were discovered faced public executions. Women's participation in the guerrilla did not arise from nowhere. Many had prior experience in the Civil War or in collectivization. They knew how to ride horses, fire hunting rifles, and navigate dense forests. Their knowledge of the terrain allowed for effective ambushes. During the winter of 1942 to 1943, a group of partisans led by Yefrosinya Zenkova destroyed 12 German trains and prevented reinforcements from reaching the Leningrad front. In another case, Liza Chaikina, head of an intelligence unit, relayed information about a German attack that allowed Soviet forces to prepare an effective defense. Her capture and execution turned her name into a symbol of resistance. These stories spread in whispers among occupied populations, encouraging people to collaborate with the resistance. While the Red Army confronted the invaders on conventional fronts, a clandestine movement emerged in forests, mountains, and occupied cities. Thousands of women took part in these partisan units. Their mission was to destabilize the German rear through sabotage, espionage, and support for the local population. The partisans knew hidden paths, how to conceal weapons, and how to obtain provisions. Their presence was a reminder that the Soviet Union would not surrender, even when the front lines seemed to collapse. Sabotage missions were among the most dangerous operations. Partisans like Olga Fedosieva led groups of women who crawled at night to place explosives on railway lines. In November 1943, Fedosieva and her comrades destroyed a crucial stretch near Smolensk, halting enemy convoys loaded with munitions. Such attacks forced the Germans to divert frontline troops to guard their supply lines, thereby easing pressure on Soviet forces. The partisans also blew up bridges, burned fuel depots, and cut communication cables. These actions were vital to the war effort, yet they were carried out without any guarantee of immediate support if something went wrong. Beyond direct action, women partisans played a crucial role as spies and couriers. Maria Polovanova, for example, infiltrated occupied towns disguised as a peasant to gather information on troop movements and artillery positions, then relayed the data to the Red Army or other partisan units. The risk of discovery was enormous. The slightest suspicion could lead to torture or immediate execution. Even so, Polovanova and many others took the risk time and again, knowing that one timely report could save hundreds of lives. Life in the forests was no less harsh than at the front. The partisans slept in makeshift shelters, ate what they could gather or steal from enemy farms, and suffered the elements. Winter was spent wrapped in damp blankets with shoes caked in mud. Every move had to be made in silence and with caution. The slightest misstep could attract German patrols. They also had to face the prejudices of some male comrades who doubted women's ability to lead or fight. Over time, however, their determination and effectiveness won respect. When they were captured, the consequences were tragic. In October 1943, during a mission to blow up a bridge over the Desna River, a group of sniper partisans was discovered. The survivors were tortured and executed publicly, and their bodies were left hanging in the town square to intimidate the population. This act of terror was meant to break the resistance's morale, but often produced the opposite effect. New volunteers joined guerrilla groups to avenge the fallen. Testimonies from surviving partisans describe the mixture of fear and camaraderie that permeated their lives. Vera Koruzhaya, leader of a unit in Belarus, organized a successful offensive against a German detachment in 1943. After her capture, she was brutally tortured and executed. Her story inspired other resistance groups. Yefrosinya Zenkova, commander of a group of 14 women, sabotaged rail lines and organized children's evacuation to safe zones. Liza Chaikina, another partisan, was betrayed by a collaborator and shot. Her last words urged her comrades to keep fighting. Women's guerrilla warfare challenged the idea that resistance was a male affair. They operated as clandestine agents, nurses, snipers, and saboteurs. Their knowledge of the terrain and ability to pass unnoticed made them irreplaceable. By war's end, it is estimated that more than 28,000 women took part in resistance activities behind enemy lines. Their clandestine struggle helped the Red Army regain positions, wreaked havoc on German logistics, and kept up the morale of civilians under occupation. The The story of these partisans shows that modern war is fought not only on battlefields, but also in the shadows, where individual cunning and courage can change the course of events. In the enemy's hands, hatred, abuse, and executions. The term Flintenweiber became a pejorative label used to justify executions and abuse. Captured women were denied the rights granted to male prisoners of war. Reports from security units that mentioned the execution of armed women alongside bandits and Jews show how the Wehrmacht classified them as criminals without the right to trial. This practice extended to the SS, who used captured women as slave labor or deported them to camps where they were subjected to medical experiments. Rank or decorations did not save them. For the Nazis, the mere fact of bearing arms was enough to order an exemplary execution. The case of Zoya Kosmodomyanskaya became a symbol of resistance for the Soviet public. Her execution was recorded by German soldiers, and the images circulated clandestinely. The Soviet state responded by raising her to martyrdom, publishing her story, and giving her name to schools. Other executed women, such as Tatiana Baramzina and Masha Bruskina, were also highlighted to inspire new volunteers. But behind those narratives were thousands of anonymous cases. For every recognized heroine, dozens disappeared without a trace. Their families received laconic telegrams, missing in action, with no way to know whether they died at the front or were murdered after suffering abuse and torture. Testimonies from the few survivors shed light on the horror. A captured sniper in Belarus recounted that she was taken to an improvised camp and locked in a shack without a roof. Every night, several guards assaulted her. After 3 weeks, barely able to stand, she and other prisoners were taken into a forest and forced to dig a pit. She survived by pretending to be dead beneath the bodies of her companions. Years later, she told her story with her face covered for fear of judgment from her own community. Another facet of the brutality was the inclusion of prisoners in frontline brothels. Unlike the official brothels in the rear, these were set up near the front to distract soldiers. Prisoners were forced to serve dozens of men per day. The policy of rest and recreation turned violence against women into a mechanism for shoring up troop morale. The Order of August 7, 1941, which excluded female combatants from any release program, institutionalized this brutality. Unlike some male prisoners, who could be exchanged or sent to agricultural labor, women were deemed too dangerous to free. The result was the disappearance of thousands, buried in anonymous pits or incinerated in extermination camps. The price of female courage was laid bare when many Soviet women combatants fell into the hands of the Wehrmacht and the SS. For the Nazi regime, these women did not fit into its misogynistic racist vision. The ideology of the Third Reich reduced women to the role of mothers and caregivers. Seeing them armed defied that ideal and provoked visceral hatred. Orders from various commands reflected this mentality. A commander of the 4th Panzer Division went so far as to state that female fighters did not deserve prisoner status, but should be hung from trees. In the field, such directives translated into summary executions. Prisoners who identified as nurses or drivers could be confined in concentration camps, though they rarely survived. Thousands ended up in facilities like Ravensbrück, the largest all-female camp. There they endured forced labor, medical experiments, and sexual abuse. Some believed that presenting themselves as medical personnel might prevent immediate execution, but many were not spared. Later investigations indicated that tens of thousands of Soviet women, including Red Army combatants, were forced to serve in frontline brothels for officers and soldiers. These assaults were used as weapons of humiliation and psychological terror intended to break prisoners' will. Women who identified as guerrillas or snipers were almost always executed on the spot. German soldiers called them Flintenweiber, literally women with shotguns, and deemed them degenerate for daring to take up arms. Reports from security divisions recorded liquidations that listed on the same line bandits, women with rifles, and Jews. That enumeration reveals the contempt with which they were classified. They were denied military status and branded as criminals to be exterminated. Nazi hatred also manifested in torture and mutilations. Zoya Kosmodomyanskaya was captured in November 1941 near Moscow. After beatings and hundreds of lashes, she was forced to march with a placard accusing her of arson. She was hanged from a tree in the village of Petrishchevo, and a drunken officer mutilated her body. It was left on display for weeks as a warning. The photographs were used as propaganda by the Nazis to intimidate and by the Soviets to inspire resistance. The young Belarusian Masha Bruskina, a member of the resistance in Minsk, helped wounded Soviet soldiers escape. Captured in 1941, she was forced to parade with a placard reading, "Traitor to the Motherland," and was hanged publicly alongside two companions. Her body remained hanging for days to cow the population. Sexual violence was a constant component of the brutality. Although the word did not appear in official reports, the testimonies of survivors and liberated populations show that many prisoners were raped repeatedly before being killed. Many were forced to serve in soldiers' barracks day after day, subjected to abuses that destroyed their bodies and will. The female body became a battlefield on which absolute dehumanization was sought. Those who survived had to return to societies that preferred silence, and speaking about it could bring scorn and discrimination. In prisoner camps, women combatants received especially harsh treatment. They were assigned the hardest labor, dragging logs, digging ditches, or hauling rocks. Guards beat them for the slightest mistake, and they lacked adequate clothing or food. Nurse Yelena Mazanik, captured in 1943, recounted that they worked until total exhaustion, and that some threw themselves against electrified barbed wire to end their suffering. Psychological terror included forcing them to witness the execution of their comrades. In other cases, they were used as targets for shooting practice or burned alive in barns with other prisoners. The cases of Tatiana Baramzina, a sniper captured in July 1944, and of other women executed in Cherkasy in October 1943, reflect this systematic brutality. Baramzina was beaten and tortured for hours before being shot and buried in a mass grave. 16 snipers captured in Cherkasy were executed one by one after days without food or water. These actions sought to eliminate any trace of female resistance and to send a message of terror to occupied territories. The policy of not releasing female prisoners was confirmed by orders from the High Command on August 7, 1941. While some male prisoners could be released for agricultural work, women of the Red Army were excluded. That directive sealed their fate. No exchanges, no farms, execution or concentration camps. The combination of extermination orders, ideological contempt, and the use of abuse as a weapon created an environment from which few female combatants emerged alive. Testimonies from survivors and reports after the liberation of the camps show that very few returned. Their fate revealed one of the darkest and least told chapters of the Second World War. Oblivion and memory after victory. The effort to recover the memory of these combatants has been arduous. Veterans began to meet in associations during the 1950s, but their voice was weak before a state that preferred to forget certain aspects of the war. Classic Soviet literature focused on male heroes and grand battles. Women appeared only as secondary figures. Poets and writers such as Margarita Aliger and Lydia Chukovskaya tried to introduce female characters into their war works, but their accounts were sidelined. The official narrative simplified the story of the combatants. They were either idealized martyrs or simply did not exist. Change began slowly. In 1965, during the 20th anniversary of victory, an exhibition in Moscow showed photographs and objects belonging to snipers and doctors. Public response was so positive that similar events were organized in Leningrad and Kiev. Some veterans, emboldened, published memoirs in literary magazines. Nevertheless, print runs were limited and many works were censored for revealing the extent of the abuses suffered. With the glasnost of the 1980s, discussion of sexual violence in war became possible. Historians such as Svetlana Alexievich gathered testimonies from women who had kept silent for decades. Her book, The Unwomanly Face of War, helped integrate their voices into the national narrative. In today's Russia, the memory of the combatants is traversed by political tensions. On one hand, there are monuments and commemorative stamps dedicated to figures like Pavlichenko and the Night Witches. On the other, some nationalist organizations have tried to minimize the enemy's crimes and to exalt the masculinity of the Soviet soldier, once again relegating the female role. Even so, the spread of documentaries, films, and series has made their stories more visible. School curricula include chapters on women in the war, and in cities such as Volgograd and Novosibirsk, museums dedicated to their legacy have been inaugurated. Contemporary debate also addresses the issue of victims' consent and dignity. Feminist activists in Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine have proposed creating psychological support centers for descendants of women veterans and fostering academic research on women's wartime experience. They argue that violence against Soviet women combatants should be studied alongside other war crimes, and that denying its existence perpetuates historical silence. For many veterans, the greatest reward is for their granddaughters to know the truth. They want younger generations to understand that the freedom they enjoy was, in part, won by women who risked everything at the front. The war officially ended on May 9, 1945. The Soviet Union celebrated victory over Nazi Germany. But for the women who had fought, healed, and resisted on every front, that day marked the beginning of a new struggle. To find their place in a society eager to return to patriarchal normality. During the victory parades, the spotlight fell on marshals and male soldiers. Women marched in discreet ranks, or, in many cases, were not invited at all. Despite having risked their lives, they returned to homes where they were expected to be wives and mothers. Some officers even rejected their disability benefit applications, claiming they had not been in real combat. The stigma particularly affected those who had been captured. Soviet culture, governed by codes of military honor, considered capture a disgrace. Freed combatants were interrogated by the NKVD and, in several cases, sent to filtration camps to assess their loyalty. A considerable number ended up in the Gulag, accused of collaborating with the enemy. For those who had suffered abuse, returning home meant enforced silence. Speaking about what happened risked stigmatization. Psychological trauma, combined with social indifference, left them mired in poverty and anonymity. Official recognition was limited. Of the hundreds of thousands of women who served, only 89 received the title Hero of the Soviet Union. Decorations were awarded mostly to snipers, aviators, and nurses whose work became emblematic. Many others who risked their lives in less visible roles were forgotten. Files on female partisans, doctors, and medics remained classified for decades. Only in the 1960s did works begin to be published acknowledging their contribution. De-Stalinization and the openness promoted by Khrushchev allowed historians and journalists to recover some of those stories. Physician-writer Vasilyeva published a fundamental work titled The Warriors of the Motherland, collecting testimonies from hundreds of combatants. Despite its importance, her book met the indifference of publishers and censors. Some officers felt that recalling women's participation detracted from men's prominence. Not until the 1970s and 1980s, during the 30th and 40th anniversary commemorations of victory, did the official discourse begin to include women more visibly. But that belated recognition did not repair the damage caused by decades of silence and marginalization. After the fall of the Soviet Union, recovering the memory of these combatants gained new momentum. Researchers from Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine gained access to declassified archives and interviewed survivors. Documentaries and novels began to tell their stories, and some local monuments were erected in their honor. The rediscovery of the night witches and of figures like Pavlichenko and Korusheya inspired new generations. Even so, the debate over how to remember the war remains polarized. In some regions, female veteranhood is exalted as a symbol of equality. In others, it remains in the background. For those who lived through the war, public recognition arrived late and with mixed feelings. Some rejoiced that their efforts were finally known. Others lamented that their comrades were no longer alive to see it. Maria Smirnova, a surgeon who treated hundreds of wounded, said in an interview in the 1980s, "They needed us then and forgot us afterwards. Now they bring flowers, but many of us are no longer here to receive them." Her words reflect the contrast between sacrifice and the indifference that followed. In recent years, scholars and activists have advocated including women's experience in educational programs and public commemorations. The memory of Soviet women combatants adds an essential dimension to our understanding of the Second World War and underscores the importance of gender equality in military history. Recognizing their legacy is not only an act of historical justice, but also a reminder that valor and sacrifice belong to no single gender. The brutal executions and mistreatment they suffered at the hands of their enemies did not erase their bravery. This account honors their courage and reminds us that their legacy endures today.